The autumn arrived not as a season, but as an eviction notice. It came in the form of cardboard boxes split at their seams, in the bruised and tilting heap of a life made suddenly, humiliatingly public on the pavement outside a rented flat in a city that did not pause for anyone's grief. Her blue coat was there, folded wrong. Her books were there, their spines broken open to the October air as though the wind might read them, or might not, as though it did not matter either way, which was, she understood, the point. Her grandmother's ceramic bowl, the one painted with small yellow birds in a pattern that was not fashionable and had never been fashionable and which she had loved precisely for this reason, sat in the gutter between a takeaway container and a crushed energy drink can. And it had not broken, which struck Mara Osi as the only mercy the morning had offered. She stood on the pavement and looked at her things, and she did not cry. She had learned, over the course of the 3 years she had given to Daniel Ashworth, 3 years of adjusting herself, of quieting her opinions, of being grateful in the way a person is grateful when they have been made to understand that gratitude is the appropriate payment for being tolerated. She had learned that tears were exactly what he wanted, and she had resolved, in the 3 minutes since she had arrived home, to find the locks changed and her life arranged on the curb like something awaiting collection, that she would give him nothing more, not one thing more, not a word, not a look, not the satisfaction of her distress. She took inventory instead. She was good at inventory. 2 suitcases, 4 boxes. A lamp she was almost certain was hers, though she had also been almost certain the flat was hers until 40 minutes ago, and certainty had proven elastic. The ceramic bowl. She crouched in her good trousers, the charcoal ones she had worn to the Heritage Policy Conference that morning, where she had presented 18 months of her research to a room of people who had, for the most part, looked at their phones. And she wrapped the bowl in the blue coat, tucking it carefully, with the attention she gave to things she had decided mattered. Around her, the street carried on with its ordinary, magnificent indifference. A bus exhaled diesel and pulled away. A cyclist swerved around her boxes without comment. A woman with a pushchair navigated the curb with practiced efficiency and did not glance down. Mara Osi was 31 years old, a contract researcher in urban heritage policy who was quietly excellent at her work and reliably invisible everywhere else. And she sat on the curb of a street she had lived on for 3 years and thought, with the dry clarity of someone who has exhausted the portion of the day reserved for surprise. This is what it looks like, to be arranged like something discarded. She was thinking this, precisely this, when she heard the convoy. She heard them before she saw them. A low, deliberate sound, not the ordinary accumulation of London traffic, but something organized, something with internal logic, the sound of machinery moving with the quiet authority of things that have never been asked to move otherwise. She looked up from the bowl in her lap. 10 black SUVs turned the corner with the unhurried certainty of objects that had never in their existence been required to hurry. A certainty that was not speed but gravity, the assurance of things that understood themselves to be significant. They filled the narrow residential street the way water fills a channel, completely, and without apology. The vehicles bore no markings she recognized, but their bearing was unmistakable to anyone who had grown up watching the news. And she had grown up watching the news, and she knew, the way one knows the grammar of ceremony before one has been taught the rules, that these were not ordinary cars. The convoy slowed. She assumed, naturally and reasonably, that they had slowed for traffic, or for a navigation correction, or for any of the 1,000 mundane reasons that a formation of black SUVs might decelerate on an ordinary residential street on a Tuesday morning in October. She looked back down at the bowl in its blue coat. She was calculating the logistics of hailing a taxi with 4 boxes and a listing lamp when she heard a door open. Not the sound of a door opened by an aide or a driver, but the particular sound of a door opened by someone who had chosen to open it themselves, with the unconcerned ease of a person accustomed to making decisions in the full expectation that those decisions will be accommodated. She looked up, and the world, without announcement, rearranged itself. The man standing on the pavement 10 feet from where she crouched with a bowl in her lap and a pen mark on her conference blouse was not what she expected. She had not, if she was honest, expected anyone. He was very tall and dressed with the quiet, absolute precision of someone who had never once in his life been required to wonder whether the thing he wore was correct, and yet who wore this precision with a particular weariness, as though the arrangement had become, over years, something he moved through rather than something he inhabited. His face was the kind of face that had been photographed many thousands of times from many angles and revealed nothing in any of those photographs, and he was looking at her with the expression of a man who has encountered something he did not put on his schedule and is deciding in real time what to do about it. His name was Kyle, Prince Kyle Adebayo Montclair, second in line to a throne that had waited 260 years for someone worthy of it and appeared, by all accounts, to be waiting still. Holder of 3 ceremonial titles and 1 real one. A name attached to a face attached to a distance so vast it had never once felt like something that could share a pavement with a person. She knew who he was, the way everyone of her generation knew who he was, abstractly, completely, from a safe and structural distance. She stood, because crouching seemed wrong, and she had spent enough of her adult life reducing herself that the reflex was something she resisted on principle, even when it would have been easier. She was aware of the pen mark on her cuff, and of her hair, and of the bowl wrapped in the coat that she was holding with both hands, and she looked at him and said nothing. He said nothing. Behind him, 9 car doors remained closed. Whatever apparatus of staff and security travelled with him had remained inside with professional discretion. He looked at her. He looked at the boxes. He looked at the lamp listing to the left. He looked at the building behind her, at the door specifically, through which none of her keys would now function. He did not ask about the door. He looked back at her, and she had the unsettling, unfamiliar sensation of being read, properly, line by line, quickly and thoroughly, with nothing left unread. "Are these yours?" he said. His voice was lower than she had expected, and more direct, stripped of social emollient, the voice of someone asking a question they intend to act upon. "Yes," she said. He absorbed the syllable. His gaze moved to the door. She did not explain. She would not explain to a stranger on the pavement, regardless of which stranger, that she had been removed from her own life by a man who had spent 3 years assuring her, in his particular quiet way, that she was fortunate to be present in it. "Right," said the prince. He said it the way a person says the word that concludes a private calculation, the word that signals the answer has been reached and the next action is already determined. And then he turned back to the convoy and said something quietly to the air beside his jaw, to an earpiece whose presence she had not registered until this moment. And 2 men emerged from the second vehicle with the smooth, definite efficiency of people who had rehearsed for many scenarios and adapted, without apparent effort, to the ones they hadn't. He turned back to her. "Where are you going?" She gave him Petra's address in Peckham. He did not recalibrate, did not exhibit any of the subtle social signals by which a person indicates that a destination is beneath their standard concern. "We'll take you." She stared at him. He looked back with the patience of someone who has made a decision slightly in advance of the conversation and is waiting, with the quality of patience that comes from long practice, for the conversation to arrive at the same point. "You don't have to—" she began. "I know," he said, with a brevity that was not curtness but conclusion, and that closed the subject by removing whatever remaining air the subject had possessed. The conversation, apparently, was concluded. She did what she always did when circumstances exceeded her ready frameworks. She was practical. She accepted. She directed the two men, who were impeccably courteous, entirely professional, and managed to convey without a single word that they had handled considerably stranger situations than this one, to the boxes and the lamp and the two suitcases, and she carried the ceramic bowl herself inside the blue coat, because she trusted no one else with the yellow birds. She was placed in the third vehicle, which was larger inside than its exterior suggested was possible, with the sealed, particular quiet of spaces that have been engineered to make the outside world a theoretical condition. The prince got in on the other side. The convoy reassembled and moved through London with the same unhurried authority it had brought to everything, and Mara sat very straight with the bowl in her lap and looked out the window at a city conducting itself normally, without reference to any of this, and thought, with the particular clarity that arrives only from the collision of an ordinary disaster and an extraordinary afternoon, that none of it was happening. And then she thought that it very clearly was. He did not make conversation. She was more grateful for this than she could have easily expressed. He looked at his phone for a portion of the journey, and she could see in the dark reflection of the window that he was not actually reading whatever was on the screen. He was thinking, using the screen as a socially legible reason to be facing a direction. She recognized this quality of stillness because she wore it herself, in rooms where she was processing something she had not yet found the correct language for. They arrived in Peckham in 29 minutes, which was not possible by ordinary London traffic logic, but appeared to be possible by convoy logic, and Petra was at the window before the vehicles had fully stopped, her face moving through approximately 6 distinct phases before settling on something that could only be described as suspended. The men were already moving boxes when Mara got out, and the prince got out too. He had insisted on getting out, with the quiet air of someone completing a task through to its natural end, and stood on this second pavement in Peckham, which appeared to have formed no opinion of him yet and was reserving judgment. He told Mara that he hoped the evening would improve upon the afternoon. She said she thought it already had. He looked at her then, a different look from the one on the first pavement, not the assessing look, but something with more temperature in it, something that arrived and lingered and was then, with deliberateness, set aside, and said, "Good." Then the convoy moved through Peckham like a dark and purposeful river, and Petra said Mara's full name with all 4 syllables given equal weight, and said nothing else, which was unprecedented, and Mara felt, for the first time since she had found the locks changed, something in her chest that had been braced since morning carefully, slowly, release. She told herself she would not see him again, and maintained this position with some discipline over the following weeks. It was the rational position. She slept on Petra's sofa, narrow but with an excellent blanket, and applied for positions, and completed a 14,000-word policy report on listed structures in post-industrial boroughs, which she delivered 3 days early and was quietly proud of. The flat she eventually found was small, and on the 4th floor of a building with an unreliable lift, and she furnished it with intention and restraint. A second-hand table, 2 chairs that matched in spirit if not in origin, a lamp that was definitively and verifiably hers. The ceramic bowl she placed on the windowsill where the morning light reached it at the angle she preferred, and the yellow birds received that light, and the bowl was exactly where it should be. And she told herself this was enough, and almost believed it. She was standing at that window on a Tuesday morning in late October, eating toast and watching the street below conduct itself without reference to her, when her phone rang with a number she did not have stored. She answered it because her mother had raised her on the principle that you never knew when a stranger was calling with something you needed. A woman introduced herself as a private secretary and used the full formal name. All of it, each component, and then said that His Royal Highness had a request, and would Mara be available for a meeting. Mara set down her toast. The bowl caught the morning light, and the yellow birds were still. She said she would be available, and the private secretary gave her a date and an address, and said they looked forward to speaking with her, and the call concluded, and Mara stood at her window for another 3 minutes before she finished the toast, cold by now, and thought about the quality of people who got out of their own car doors. She met him 5 days later at an office in a building with no exterior signage, whose interior was the precise inverse of the declared grand spaces she'd associated with his name. Quiet, spare, full of pale winter light from a skylight she couldn't locate. He was already there when she arrived, standing at the window with his hands behind his back, in the posture of a man accustomed to waiting in a room, and he turned when she came in and said, "You found it." "Eventually," she said. He gestured toward a chair, and she sat, and he sat across from her, and there was a small table between them with 2 cups of tea on it, and it was so ordinary and so profoundly strange simultaneously that she had the sensation of being a figure in 2 photographs overlaid at once. He told her what he needed without preamble. A year had passed, rather longer than a year, since his mother's death. The palace had become what he described carefully as a residence. Rooms closed, staff not replaced. The routines that distinguish a home from a building, the small ceremonies, the rhythms, the daily accumulation of inhabited detail had dissolved, and what remained was function. Clean floors, fed fires, meals at regular intervals, and nothing more. He needed a household director, someone to manage the estate and its staff, and to restore, without announcement or theatre, the working life of the house. He described it as a procurement requirement, with the flat precision of a man who has learned to use that register for everything. And she listened, and when he had finished, she said, "You're not looking for a household director." A silence. He regarded her with the expression she had not yet catalogued, but would come to know well. "No," he said. "I'm looking for someone who knows how to make a place feel inhabited again." She looked at him across the small table and 2 cups of tea, and thought about 18 months of research into how places come to feel like themselves, and how they stop, and what it takes, and what cannot be forced, to start again. She said, "All right." He said, "You haven't asked about terms." She said, "Tell me." He did, and the terms were reasonable. And when she left the building an hour later into a November afternoon that had taken on the specific grey of the city considering what to do next, she walked further than the nearest underground required, and thought about inhabited places, and their opposites, and a man who had said what he needed plainly and without performance, and who had asked her what she thought and appeared to intend to act on what she said. We'll take a very short break. If you don't want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. She moved into the east wing of the estate on a Friday in early November, when the grounds wore the colour of old pewter, and the sky sat low and white above the bare trees, with the particular density of English winter that is not yet storm but has made its preparations. The house was large in the way of houses built for permanence rather than any specific human scale, and it held its size like a held breath, grand, cold, and waiting for someone to decide what it was waiting for. The housekeeper, Mrs. Adesanya, met her at the main entrance with the expression of a woman who had supervised the arrival of many new people and developed considered opinions about all of them. She was 63, compact, with the bearing of someone who had earned her authority through 4 decades of being right, and she showed Mara the rooms that were still in use and the rooms that were no longer in use, which were considerably more numerous. In the east drawing-room, she pulled back the edge of a dust cover, with the air of a surgeon demonstrating a wound. Beneath it were the gilt frames of family portraits, faces covered in pale linen. "He had them covered after Her Majesty passed?" she said, with a neutrality so complete it communicated everything. Mara stood in the room, high-ceilinged, smelling of cold stone and of time sealed in on itself, and thought, "This is not a room. This is a held breath that no one has released. She did not replace the cover. She moved on without comment, and Mrs. Adesanya watched this with an expression that shifted, by some fraction too small to measure, toward something that was not yet approval, but was adjacent to attention. Mara spent her first week making a different kind of list. She met the staff one by one, not in any formal space, but in the kitchen at the long table, over tea, at times that suited them rather than her schedule. She learned that Thomas the gardener had been with the household for 22 years and had maintained the rose garden with the fidelity of a man tending a sacred text, though nothing had been cut for the house in 2 years. She learned that Sissy, the youngest housemaid, had been 4 weeks from leaving when the previous director retired, because no one had spoken a word to her that was not a directive in 4 months, and she had understood from this that she was of no particular account. She learned that Mr. Yeboah, the chef, had been cooking for a household of one for so long that he had scaled everything down, portions, variety, presentation, without comment, until the meals he produced had become a kind of architectural statement about the nature of solitude, competent, joyless, exactly sufficient. She did not announce changes. Changes announced are changes argued about, and she had no interest in arguments. She simply began. 3 more fireplaces lit each evening, citing the November damp, which was accurate. 2 closed rooms opened and aired, citing the need to inventory their contents, also accurate. In a storeroom on the lower ground floor, she found 12 silver candlestick holders wrapped in felt and boxed by someone who had expected a specific occasion that had not arrived, and she had them cleaned and arranged along the mantelpiece of the small sitting room off the library, his room, the one where the lamp stayed on past 11 most nights, because she believed, as a professional conviction and a personal one, that light was not a luxury to be rationed, but a condition that changed everything it entered. The first evening she placed them there, she came to check the arrangement and found him already in his chair, a document in one hand, unread. He looked at the candles. He looked at her. He said nothing. But when she turned to leave, she heard him, in the room behind her, exhale, very quietly, the way a person exhales when something inside them has, without warning or preparation, shifted. She walked to her own room and thought that a house is a living thing, and that living things respond to care, and that care, applied with patience to the right places, can move even the most settled cold. The days assembled themselves into a rhythm that no one had decreed. She learned his schedule without being given it, the way one learns a house from its sounds, which door opened first in the morning, when the kettle was heard, when the study light came on, and when it went off, which was often very late. He worked with the intensity of someone who had decided that the volume of work was the appropriate answer to the volume of silence. And he ate with the distracted practicality of someone who had long since stopped thinking of meals as anything other than maintenance. She addressed this not by comment. She had learned quite early that comment produced nothing but a stillness that was not receptive, but by occasionally placing things at his elbow, a plate beside the documents on the desk, a cup where his hand would find it, accompanied by nothing but a fork and a folded napkin. He ate them. He never acknowledged them directly, which she did not resent, because acknowledgment was not the currency he dealt in freely, and she was not keeping accounts. And then one morning she found on her desk a note in an envelope with no name on it, handwritten on official stationery, in a hand that was direct and made no apologies for itself. "The soup was good. Thank you." She read it twice and put it in the pocket of her coat, where it stayed for rather longer than could be professionally justified, and she thought about it periodically in the days that followed with a warmth she applied no analysis to. The rose garden was her first real project. Thomas received her proposal, that cuttings be started in the forcing house, that arrangements begin appearing in the house again, with a stillness that was not resistance, but something more careful. The consideration of a person deciding whether a trust has been earned. He said, looking at the dormant beds. They were Her Majesty's particular love. She said, I know. I think she would have wanted them to be seen. Thomas was quiet for a long time, standing at the edge of the beds in the bare November light, his hands in his coat pockets. Then, without looking at her, I'll start cuttings this week. The first roses appeared on the hall table in December, pink, slightly defiant, the exact color of something that has survived despite the odds, and Mrs. Adesanya walked past them 3 times before she stopped and touched one petal very briefly with one finger, with the quality of someone touching something they have not permitted themselves to touch, and said nothing, but her face performed a motion that Mara committed to memory. The dining table was the other matter. It was 16 feet long and had been set for 2 years with a single place at the far end, a setting formally correct and quietly one of the loneliest images she had encountered in a domestic space. She did not propose shortening it. She asked instead whether the smaller west dining room, with its circular table and 4 chairs, might be used for daily meals, citing the fuel savings in not heating the larger room. He agreed without ceremony. The first evening they sat at the circular table together was not planned. He was passing when the food was ready, and she indicated there was enough, and he sat, and it was done. She noticed that he kept his eyes on his plate for most of the meal, and that once he looked up, across the table's small circumference, and appeared briefly surprised to find another person there, as though his surroundings required updating to include the fact. She talked about the house, the rose cuttings, a piece of furniture in one of the opened rooms that warranted professional assessment. Once she mentioned a detail of the East Wing's architectural history that she had found in the household records, and he corrected her gently with a detail that was not in any record she had found. She looked at him. He said, "My mother told me." It was the first time he had spoken of her voluntarily, and it was a small sentence, and it sat at the table with them without requiring anything further, and she received it with the care with which it had been offered, and the conversation moved on, and the evening concluded, and she lay awake a long time that night with the certainty that something had changed, though she could not yet say into what it was changing. She did not push. This was the center of everything she did in that house, and the hardest discipline to maintain, not because she was by nature impatient, but because there were moments, with increasing frequency, when she could see him at the edge of something he wanted to say or feel or allow, and she wanted, with an urgency she applied no careful examination to make the edge easier to step over. But she had learned, from years of working with places that had forgotten their own nature, that return cannot be forced. You could make the conditions. You could be patient. Patience was her oldest skill and her most practiced one. She had exercised it at tables where people spoke over her and across her and around her as though she were furniture with better manners. In offices where her work was credited to others with a smoothness that suggested this was simply the natural direction that credit traveled. In a rented flat where she had made herself smaller and smaller until the day she came home to find that there was nothing left of herself to make smaller, and her life had been arranged on the pavement as though even its remnants required disposal. Patience in all those cases had not been rewarded. But this felt different, less like waiting to be noticed, and more like standing very still in a room while someone learned that the room was safe, and that the person in it would not ask anything of him that he was not ready to give. He began to speak in December. Not often and not at length, but with the deliberateness of someone choosing each confidence, a small, careful thing, offered with both hands. He told her one evening by the library fire that he had not read for pleasure in 4 years. She asked what he used to read. He told her the titles, the authors, what he had found in them, with a specificity that told her these were not idle preferences, but things he had genuinely inhabited. She found 3 of the books in the library's holdings and placed them on the side table beside his chair without comment, and 2 mornings later the first had been moved. He told her another evening that the east wing had been his mother's design entirely. The rooms, the garden, the morning light orientation of that whole side of the house. That she had made it express something about how she believed a house should feel. That when she died, and he had not been present, because he had been on the other side of the world concluding a state matter that could not wait, and there had been nothing fast enough. He had come into the east drawing-room the morning after the funeral, and the light was the same light his mother had chosen for it, and the room smelled of her perfume, rose and something warmer underneath, and he had stood in it and understood that the smell would go, and the light would stay, and there was nothing to be done about either. And he had covered the portraits because it was the only thing in the room he could do anything about. Mara said, after a long silence, because it was the one thing in the room that wouldn't disappear on its own. He turned to look at her. Yes, he said. The fire moved. The room was warm in a way the house had not been warm in 2 years. After a long time she stood and said good night, and he said it back. Mara, he said, her name for the first time, in the voice of a man who has been careful with names because he knows what it costs to say them. And she went to her room and sat in the dark for a long time, aware of the quality of a key in a lock, and deciding deliberately not to name anything she felt, because naming it would require deciding what to do about it, and what to do about it was not yet clear, and she was patient. She had always been patient, and she held the warmth of the evening in her hands like something she did not yet know how to carry. The world's interruption arrived in the form of an obligation. The Thornbury Winter Gala had sent its invitation, as it did every year to every name of any standing, and he had declined, as he had declined for 3 years. This year, for reasons connected to a charitable endowment of some political sensitivity and the diplomatic costs of continued social withdrawal, his private secretary placed the matter before him with the emphasis that signals movement from request to requirement. He asked Mara, not the secretary, not his counsel, not any of the several advisers whose function was to be consulted, he asked Mara, in the library on a Wednesday evening, what she thought. She thought about it honestly, and said she thought he should go, and that his attendance alone would constitute the story the papers told regardless of everything else, and that if he did not wish to spend 3 hours of a gala without a natural social orbit, she could accompany him in her professional capacity, which was the correct designation, and would draw rather less speculation than any other. He said, with the near flatness of his dry register, "You think my attending alone would draw less attention than you beside me?" She said, "I think the fact of your attendance will be the story, and I would rather be useful than decorative, and I am not under the impression that the two are the same thing." He regarded her for a moment with the expression she had catalogued, the one that arrived and lingered rather longer than usual before being set aside, and said, "All right." She wore a gown that had not been hers 3 weeks prior. Mrs. Adesanya had appeared at her door on a Tuesday morning with a garment bag and the expression of absolute professional neutrality, and inside was a dress the colour of deep water at dusk. Not blue precisely, not quite grey, something that existed in the particular quality of winter light at the moment when the sun has gone, but the sky has not yet made its decision. His Highness indicated, said Mrs. Adesanya, that something appropriate for the occasion might be required. She offered nothing further. Mara took the dress. It fit without alteration, which she chose not to examine too carefully. She wore her hair simply, because her hair had never been fashionable, and she had made a long peace with this, and she wore her ordinary small earrings, and she looked at herself in the glass, and saw herself, which was, she had come to understand recently, not the same as seeing nothing at all. The Thornbury Winter Gala was held in a hall that had been designed to demonstrate, with some insistence, the upper limit of what grandeur could achieve when given both resources and ambition. The chandeliers were legendary in the social register in the specific way of things mentioned before any other detail when the venue is described. The room was full of exactly the quality of brilliance she had always found faintly exhausting, not because she resented brilliance, but because brilliance of this particular arrangement had always organized itself so that she was on its periphery, and she had accepted this for so long that she no longer noticed the accepting. She moved through it with her usual quality of quiet, noticing everything, remarking on none of it, meeting eyes easily, and remembering every name and every detail attached to those names. He remained within a courteous orbit of her all evening, not attached, not declarative, simply present in the particular way of a person who is aware of one specific person in a room and has made a quiet decision about that awareness. At one point she stood at the edge of a conversation she had no wish to enter, looking instead at a painting above the fireplace, a 17th-century formal portrait with a compositional quality she was trying to place when she felt him appear beside her. He said very quietly, "The man in the left panel appears to have been somewhere else for the entire sitting." She said, "I think it's the hands. They're the only part of him that agreed to be there." He looked at the hands, then at her, and the almost smile arrived. Not quite a smile, the ghost of one at the corner of his mouth, lasting the length of a breath before it was gone. And she looked back at the painting, and the moment closed over them like water over a stone, warm and complete, and instantly, perfectly unreachable. It was then that she saw Isabelle Durand. The woman in the gold dress was several inches taller than Mara, and several orders of magnitude more luminous in the way of women who have organized their entire existence around luminosity, and are therefore very effective at it. And she moved across the room with the unhurried confidence of someone accustomed to having rooms adjust for her, which they did. Her name had appeared in 3 years of royal correspondence in a way that told Mara, without requiring a single explicit statement, what that name had meant and what it apparently still assumed it meant. She arrived with the smile of someone using a social instrument to claim territory. "Kyle," she said, with the intimacy of prior claim. She did not look at Mara. The not looking was its own declaration. You are peripheral. You are staff at an event. You are not a factor in any calculation I am currently running. Mara looked back at her with the steadiness she had always maintained in the face of contempt that does not bother to disguise itself because it has decided the target is not worth the effort. Said, "How do you do with genuine pleasantness?" and excused herself quietly when the conversation arranged itself to exclude her. She went to find something to drink and took a position near a window at the far end of the room. And she stood there, and she was entirely fine. She had been not noticed by more formidable women in more consequential rooms and had walked out of all of them intact. She looked out at the lit courtyard below and thought about Thomas's rose beds, and the second book on the side table moved 2/3 through, and the note in the pocket of her coat at the house. She was thinking about warmth and roses, and the quality of a name spoken for the first time, in a voice that places it with care, when she became aware of the room changing, not in sound, not in any specific movement, but in the reorientation of attention that a social gathering performs when the gravity of a scene alters. Faces turning, conversation dimming, the organism of the room redirecting itself toward a single point. She turned. He was crossing the room. Not toward Isabel, who had established herself near the central chandelier with the settled composure of someone who has concluded the evening is proceeding according to plan. Not toward any of the obligations that typically managed his movements through public spaces. He was crossing toward her, toward where she stood at the edge of the room, as she had always stood at the edges, with the direct, unhurried certainty of someone who has made a decision before he stood up and is simply completing it, and every person in the room understood, with the instinct that operates below social processing, that something was happening that had not been planned and could not be managed. He reached her. He stopped. His face was entirely composed, which she had long since learned was the face he wore when he was feeling something he had not yet decided to articulate. He said, "I've been looking for you." She said, "I was here." He said, "I know. I've been watching you stand here being entirely fine, and I need you to know—" He stopped. He began again. "I need you to know that you are the most—" He stopped again, and she waited without filling the silence, because she had learned that the spaces he paused in were not empty, but full, and filling them would displace what was already there. He said quietly and plainly, without decoration, "I owe you more than I have managed to say. And I am going to say it now, in this room, in front of every person in it, because I have learned this year, in my house, which is no longer cold, that the moments a person chooses not to speak become, over time, the life they did not intend to live." He turned briefly to where Isabel stood with the expression of a woman whose plan has encountered an unforeseen variable and has not yet arrived at the correct response. He said, in a voice the room could hear entirely, "I believe certain people in this room have been privately circulating statements about my household director that they have not seen fit to make directly. I would invite those people to consider whether they would like to repeat them with the same confidence they have apparently enjoyed in their absence." Near the south wall, a young man named Edouard, who had spent 3 weeks circulating a story of fabricated impropriety in exchange for the promise of a gambling debt quietly resolved, went the specific color of someone who has understood that the promised resolution has been cancelled and the debt recalled. Isabel said nothing. There was nothing to say. The room had formed its verdict, and rooms of that kind did not reverse their verdicts. He turned back to Mara and said, "I chose you. Not because the house needed managing, though it did. Not because I required the function you provide, though I did. I chose you because I watched you, on a pavement in October, wrap a ceramic bowl in a coat as though it mattered most in the world. And it mattered because you had decided it did. You make things matter. You made my house matter again. You made the people in it matter again. You made—" The almost smile arrived and held and did not retreat, and became something she had not seen before on his face. The full thing, unguarded and unheld. The real version of it. And it remade his face entirely, and she felt something in her own chest complete emotion it had been in the middle of for months. "You made me want to be inside my own life again," he said, "and I should like very much to continue doing so, with you in it, for as long as you will allow it." The room was very still. She said, "Kyle." Only his name. The key turning in the lock, all the way through on both sides. He said, "Yes." And the distance between them, which had been closing since October by the width of a note on official stationery, by a cut rose on a hall table, by an exhale in a candle-lit room, by a book moved 2/3 through, closed the rest of the way. Isabel Durand left before the dessert course was served, which was noted by a considerable number of people and commented upon by none in her presence, because the room had formed its position and moved on. Edouard discovered in the days that followed that the gambling debt had found its records with the minimum of effort, as records tend to do when someone with appropriate authority chooses to look, and that the promise he had traded on was not honored, and that certain rooms in certain houses had developed a reluctance to open for him that showed no sign of resolving. He requires no further portion of the narrative's attention. Isabel's story is, in its own way, more considered. She went home that evening to an apartment that was very large and very beautiful and very silent, and she sat in it, and the verdict of the Thornberry Winter Gala settled over her like a season arriving without welcome. It would be false and ungenerous not to acknowledge that beneath the gold dress and the territorial smile and the claim enacted with a name, she had been genuinely fond of him, in her fashion, in the fashion available to a woman who had been taught from childhood that beauty was her most significant asset and her only reliable currency, who had organized her entire life around this teaching, with the thoroughness of someone following the only map she had ever been given, and who had never once been offered a different cartography. She was diminished. She was not destroyed. The narrator does not rejoice in what she lost, because the fault for what she was lay with more than herself, and the education she had been denied was a real deprivation, and pity is the only honest thing to extend to someone who arrives at the limit of everything they were taught to believe is possible and finds it is not enough. The story moves on, and leaves her there, and wishes her, honestly, without condescension, the things she had never been taught to look for. 1 year later, in November, the East drawing-room had its dust covers removed, properly, finally, permanently, in the morning light, with Thomas's first winter roses already on the hall table, and a smell of beeswax, and something warmer moving through the east wing. The family portraits came back to their walls, a woman with warm eyes and the quality of presence that had given the room its direction, a man with a direct gaze and the set of the jaw that ran in the family, and one face that was younger, guarded even in oil paint, the almost smile caught by a painter who had perhaps had more access to the subject than most had managed. On the table beneath the window, in the ceramic bowl painted with small yellow birds, a spray of pale roses stood in water. Thomas had, in the second full growing year of the restored garden, used the word magnificent to describe the rose beds, unprompted in Mara's hearing, and she had understood this to be his version of an ovation and received it accordingly. Mrs. Adesanya brought tea at 4, as she always did, and said nothing particular, as she often did, but paused at the door of the east drawing-room before leaving and looked at the room. The uncovered portraits, the roses in the bowl, the light doing precisely what it had been chosen to do, and her face performed the brief, private motion that meant she was satisfied, which was, in the register of Mrs. Adesanya's expression, a position very close to joy. The west dining-room circular table still had 4 chairs around it, and 3 were in use because the third had been necessary since August, when a person of very small dimensions and very large opinions had arrived in the household and established within her first week an understanding with Mrs. Adesanya based on mutual recognition of authority, and a separate and different understanding with Thomas, who had decided, in his own time, on his own terms, which was the only way Thomas decided anything, that the small person might eventually be permitted to touch the roses after all. He read to her after supper each evening, in the low and unhurried voice that did not perform the reading but inhabited it, and Mara found, as she had found with increasing constancy throughout the year, that she could listen to that voice indefinitely, without any portion of her attention wishing to be elsewhere. He had smiled so many times by now that it had ceased to be a remarkable event, though she retained without deciding to the habit of noticing each instance. She noticed it that evening when the small person objected with considerable force to a chapter's ending, and he looked up from the book and found Mara watching, and the smile arrived, full, unguarded, the real version of it, the one that had been there all along beneath the almost. And she thought, this is what it is, to be the fixed point in someone's room, not the decorative one, not the useful one, not the one tolerated for the duration of her utility, the fixed point, the one looked for. He had not rescued her. She was clear on this and had always been clear, because rescue implies a deficit of resource, and she had never been without resource. She had been without recognition, which is a different deficit entirely, and the one that had, for 31 years, gone unaddressed. He had not rescued her. He had stopped his convoy on a pavement and gotten out of his own door and looked at her properly, line by line, quickly and completely, and asked where she was going, and taken her there, and then, months later, in a quiet room in pale winter light, asked her what she thought, and meant it, and acted on her answer. He had crossed rooms, he had left notes, he had moved books and eaten soup left at his elbow, and exhaled in a candle-lit room the particular exhale of a man for whom something, without warning or preparation, had shifted. He had not been lucky to find her. He had simply, on one particular October afternoon on a London pavement, been paying attention. And she had been there, as she had always been, quiet and capable and entirely fine, and expecting nothing in particular, which was why, when it arrived, she had been ready for it completely, had known it for what it was, had received it with both hands, had understood from the first that the bowl mattered. Not because someone told her it did, but because she had decided it did, and she had been right, and the yellowbirds caught the light, and the roses were magnificent, and the room was warm, and it was home, and that was everything, and it was enough. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.